I'm Frederick Gerten, and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
How does it feel to be an advocate over there in Canada? Is it good?
Well, I am fully vaccinated as of yesterday, so I'm feeling actually pretty lousy.
Okay, sorry. Happy for you, and sorry for you.
Yes.
But to be an activist is also, I mean, people ask you all the time about what you think about things that happens, not only in your country, but also in your own country. And I've seen a lot of stories from Toronto popping up. Mm-hmm. What is that? The police force moving in towards the homeless.
Yeah, so I'm getting a lot of traffic around how my work has been a terrible failure in Toronto. Yesterday, hundreds of police officers and security forces, drones moved into a park where about, I don't know, maybe 20 to 40 homeless people were living. And they moved in on the mayor's instructions and they tried to remove everyone. They were offering people hotel accommodation, shelters, and the people living there didn't want to go because of COVID, fear that they'd get COVID in those places, and because the places have a lot of rules that they can't live by. They're really like kind of prisons of some sort. So there was a big standoff, and it was very depressing to see that. I mean, why, for me, dialogue. That's how we solve things. Dialogue. We should be talking, and you have to talk to the people and ask them what they need, and then we'll have happier societies.
We don't like violence against homeless people.
We don't.
We can see that there's a frustration in society to have a lot of homeless people on the streets, but then, for God's sake, solve it in a decent way.
Exactly.
People shouldn't sleep on the streets. That's the position of the filmmaker and the advocate.
It is.
Or maybe elsewhere, around, from the advocate and the filmmaker. We are flying around the globe on Zoom. We're zooming around the world. And you are in Ottawa, Canada. I'm in Malmö, Sweden. And today so that's 6-hour time difference. But then we are now going all the way to New Zealand. That's 10 hours away from Malmö.
It's like more from Ottawa, many more.
Okay. We are actually flying to New Zealand because of your last visit as a UN Special Rapporteur went to New Zealand, where you actually looked in the depth of the housing policies of that country. So let's invite our guest, our friend, Brennan Rigby, who is the head he works for Shift Aotearoa. So that's a New Zealand, the Shift. And he's an activist and he's a cool guy. Welcome to Pushback Talks, Brennan.
Thanks for the invitation.
We don't know so much about New Zealand. We know that it's really far away. You hear that a lot, but it's also true. I've been to New Zealand once. I was there for 2 days, which is like a little bit silly. But I showed a film. It was nice. I was in Auckland. Where are you based?
In Auckland too, yep.
In Auckland. So I've been to your town for 2 days. That's kind of amazing. I was flying from Los Angeles then to Australia. So what's cooking in the housing issues on New Zealand?
Well, Leilani, when we were talking about this yesterday, she used the words, what's cooking, and I just immediately started thinking about all of the ingredients, right? And so as Leilani sort of flagged, New Zealand has an extremely high rate of homelessness. So what's cooking in New Zealand? Heaps of the same stuff as what's cooking around the world. Really high prices, really low interest, lots of investment. But also, I'm really keen to talk about the difference between social housing supply and what's happening in the market, right? So for me, they're very different problems. And in New Zealand, we haven't built social housing between 1991 and 2018. So, big surprise, we've got a massive undersupply. And so I asked myself this question, this homelessness issue, is this being caused by what's happening in the market, high prices, high transaction rates, profit making, or is it being caused by our undersupply of social housing, which is our social contract between the government and our citizens, And for me, it's pretty clear, right? It's actually not necessarily, it's not just connected to the market.
Yeah, it's both for sure. So in my 10 days in New Zealand, or 12 days, whatever it was, I was actually struck by the difference in the way investment in housing was working. It wasn't these mega investors like private equity firms like Blackstone and Round Hill Capital and that kind of thing. In fact, it seemed to be everyday New Zealanders, yes, affluent ones, but who would just like own multiple homes. And I have to tell the story, Brennan. I have to tell the story of us taking a cab out to a motel and getting in the cab. You and I were talking about housing, and we get in the cab and the cab driver is like, "Oh, what are you talking about?" And we said that we were talking about whether second homes should be taxed. And he got right in there and then revealed that he owned himself, a taxi driver, owned many homes himself. So that to me is quite unique about New Zealand, but I don't know if that's still the case.
Yeah, I think it is part of what's unique about New Zealand's market. I guess there was a period historically where homeowner, like many countries, you can go back through our policy sets which relate to housing, and they relate to how we set up tax on superannuation. They relate to all sorts of little trinket pieces of policy over the years that actually underlying them say to people in New Zealand, if you own a home, you'll get certain breaks, you'll get certain opportunities. And they're not just about living in them as a home with a family. They're actually about the financial revenue or the financial gains you can accrue over time. So you put that alongside relatively low interest rates, especially at the moment. But more importantly, people in New Zealand are very aware of how they can use their equity in their first property to get into the second property. That's something that just seems really prolifically obvious to New Zealanders, so that sort of jumping from being a single homeowner to being an owner of two houses, and on, right? Until you find yourself being one of the people who gets locked out of the auctions because the bid goes 10,000 above what you can afford.
That story of housing being a great investment. I mean, people talk about investment, and also normal people talk about, the people who have something, they try to place it on the stock market or buy something, or they buy a house and they rent it out. So it's like normal, but the problem that it could be all fine, but suddenly when it scales up, it creates a lot of problems. When I was doing research for Push, one of the stories that came out was that your Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, she banned foreigners from buying homes in New Zealand. So that was something quite strong that went around the world. And that was, of course, about foreign investments coming into the country. So that wasn't New Zealanders buying house. It was actually foreign investments. And so what was that story?
That's both a great question and a tricky one, because in my opinion, as an observer of that issue, there was a lot of politics in that, right? So the degree of evidence to show that overseas investment in our housing market was genuinely the problem, and was a significant problem in our housing market. I've never really seen a great deal of evidence that was a problem. Do I completely support responses to this kind of housing crisis being not just one thing, but a number of little things, right? And so I'm certainly not suggesting for a second that it was the wrong thing to do, but the degree to which that particular problem was significant within our housing market generally needs to be compared against those other kind of cultural flows of capital, agile capital issues, where that investment in housing is so easy. And as an economist would say, a market can only operate on the basis of really good property rights. So that's what becomes really easy about investing in houses, right? You've got much stronger property rights than you do in most other asset classes. And so, yeah, I'm sort of a little ambivalent on the overseas investment issue only because, so let me leave you with two things. I thought it was a great move, and it was certainly a powerful signal, but I think that signal was primarily political and only secondarily actually really about fixing the housing crisis. In fact, it wasn't about fixing the housing crisis at all. It was about one pragmatic move that was available at that time.
Because this is something we talk a lot about when we talk about Berlin, we talk about Spain, we talk about Sweden, we talk about pension money, hedge funds, private equity coming in and grabbing homes. And we have all the real estate investment trusts who are building dark towers around the cities around them. So I thought that was the issue in New Zealand, but it's not, or it's not as much. Is that what you're saying, Leilani?
Yeah, so when I met with government in New Zealand, I asked them, because like you, Brennan and Frederick, I thought it was a pretty bold move, and she came out the gate with it, right? It was one of the first legislative moves she made when she was elected back then. So I was like, wow, super cool. And then when I talked, in fact, to one of the fellows who was involved in putting forward that legislation, he said it was a bit he didn't use the word failure, but he said it was a bit of a red herring. In other words, the numbers that they had received as like how much foreign investment there was were wrong, and that this wasn't the big issue that they thought it was. And he was also slightly embarrassed, I think, because there was a racist overtone to the legislation. That the Chinese were coming and buying in New Zealand. That was, and he was quite humiliated by that. So he was walking back from the legislation. But I wonder now, with the pandemic and the way things are working, and people are buying, they're sitting in New York and they don't have to go anywhere and they're just looking online and they're buying. I wonder if New Zealand's market now is going to be more open to foreign investment. I have no idea.
I think the rule stays in place, right? And so that's a good thing. But it's interesting that you frame it up that way, which I guess I hadn't done, Leilani. So thanks for being really clear about the underlying drivers of that policy, because I think that that question of specific buyers from overseas waltzing in and taking homes off Kiwi families, was kind of the political narrative. But it goes alongside another one, which is really, it's just worth noting in this context, right? Which is often we find in the housing crisis discussion, we come up against another related point, which is, should we be stopping immigration? Because that's taking up our housing stock as well. And how can we possibly be taking 1,500 refugees a year, which of course has been interrupted by COVID as well. But how can we have that kind of figure when we've got an undersupply of housing?
It gets nasty. I'm sad to hear. There's so much beautiful things coming out from New Zealand, but this sounds like you're in the same kind of mess that we have also over here in Europe.
But let's say a culturally bound mess.
Okay, so it's in your blood, you mean?
Maybe.
Leilani, you had some really scary numbers about New Zealand.
I do. I know that in the last 12 months or so, housing costs have increased by almost 25%. That's pretty astronomical. I know that New Zealand also has the highest rate of homelessness of the OECD countries. You have double the amount of homelessness than your neighbors, Australia. It's pretty bad. So people are struggling in New Zealand, I think, or at least people who don't have a lot of money, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely, Leilani. It's a tragedy, right? And I actually have trouble navigating this a little bit. As I said earlier, for me, the critical problem of an undersupply of social housing is a different problem to the critical problem of how much it costs to live in housing on the open market in New Zealand. And just reading some of your recent work, Leilani, sort of being very clear about that point, that as richer people become richer through home ownership, poorer people become poorer because the costs of living in those homes increases.
That's the global story, obviously. But you can see it in a very practical, small scale. But that's the global story. The rich, the billionaires got 25 or was it 44% richer during the pandemic, and people without the same resources are paying more and more for their rent or their housing costs. So that's a global story.
That's right. But it's also a story that, for me, it perpetuates the neoliberal paradigm, right? It continues to reaffirm and restate a position that we should be relying on the market to provide access to housing. And I think if we're going to break down that narrative, we need to stop using it. And so that's why I'm like, this is actually a question of social housing supply by governments. It's not, for me in New Zealand, there's no way of analysing our housing market that makes it possible for someone who would be a social housing tenant to be a participant in the market. That's an astronomical leap, right?
I think I think the very word market is something very strange, and it's because we talked about the US, 40 million people in the US are one rent away from eviction. So are these 40 million then a market at all? What are they? They are like out of the market. So I wish people who are in the market model or pricing could tell me, who are these people? Are they a part of the market or not? Or they just left out? And then what? It's a bit strange. Because here in Sweden, we've had a political crisis due to market rent, where some conservative parties think that the market rent will save. It will suddenly, the housing crisis will be fine. Everything will happen if we let all the rents free. I doubt it, and it scares me because I'm living in a city-owned building, and my rent would probably be doubled if that happened, and then I will have to move. So it is actually really scary. Leilani, you were in New Zealand and as a UN special rapporteur, and then you normally make a report. You have a press conference, you meet the government, and you tell them you better shape up. So I guess you mostly talked about the homeless. What more did you tell them?
I was really working hard to get them to understand housing as a human right, actually. And it goes to Brennan's point about social housing. I felt that there was such a lack of culture around human rights as they might relate to housing in particular, and that unless they got their head around the idea that people have the right to, for example, a place that they can afford based on their income, and that they determine the market, which is that they can't compete in an open market, that unless the government understood that, I didn't think that they would solve their housing crisis. I really was trying to push them to adopt like a big, broad, rights-based housing strategy as a way of trying to help undo the culture, this market-driven culture. It's very palpable in New Zealand. I mean, home ownership is the thing. I mean, Frederick, you and I talk about this. You go to the bar, everyone's talking about real estate. You go to the barbershop, everyone's talking about real estate. And it felt like that in New Zealand. So that's what I was pushing. And then I was so happy that Brennan wanted to start the shift. Aoteara had actually already was just beginning to start, and was really interested in bringing human rights language and principles to the New Zealand context.
So, Brennan, how do you get the language out, the human rights language, out to the people in the beautiful country of New Zealand?
Oh, well, it turns out that that's a lot trickier than I thought, Frederick. So I've got to do a shout out, actually, just going back to my intro. So I work for Community Housing Aotearoa, which is the peak sector body for community housing providers here in Aotearoa. And actually, it was my chief executive, Scott Figgin-Show, who kind of got the wheels turning on this idea of a Shift Aotearoa project. And for me, that was never about anything really apart from chasing the right to housing and trying to mitigate this financialization problem. And so I've always been pretty clear about that. But 2 years in, and we've just run a really brief online conference last week, actually, which was pretty amazing. We had, well, of course, Frederick, you joined us for a conversation about narrative, and we played our game show, Leilani, which maybe we'll get onto a bit later. But, coming into the conference, I had a couple of goals. One was I wanted to introduce a whole bunch of new voices to the landscape, which I did, because that was a question of trying to say, let's not try and get the usual voices we hear from talking about something different. Let's get some new people in to talk about what they believe in about the right to housing. And to a certain extent, that was successful. But I kept on revolving back to the same question, which was, listen, we're on a Zoom call. Can anyone on this Zoom call name the 7 elements of the right to housing? And I just sort of did that again and again. And it turns out that that's kind of the level that we're at in Aotearoa with the language.
So what are elements? Tell me.
Sure. So, it's human right, it's right to housing 101, right? So great question. Affordability, and people go, oh, that's a good one. And Leilani's counting. Accessibility. I love the accessibility one. Leilani and I worked with a wonderful colleague in New Zealand who I had never met before, Dr. Robbie Francis Watini, who's just actually a human rights genius. Location, which has numerous strategic undertones. Cultural adequacy, which is really about what New Zealand currently calls place-based developments, which is, hey, as Leilani said recently, that means that the government's actually got to be responsive for what's needed on the ground in a community, not just chucking stuff at it. Where have I got to, Leilani?
4.
Oh, no. Habitability. That's an easy one.
It's a hugely important one for New Zealand, habitability. They've got all sorts of leaky, drafty, cold. New Zealand's not a warm country. You're not a warm country, and you've got all these drafty homes.
Yeah, over the last 100 years, we've built houses for basically a tropical climate, minus the cyclones. Habitability. But, this is the one that always gets people, right? Security of tenure. What happens? So I was just in a meeting last week talking about this at a community housing provider. So just explaining that. So the main principle, and you must correct me, Leilani, but this is how I understand it in the New Zealand context, is the main principle that sits behind that is that you can't be evicted into homelessness. So if we apply that across not only the private rental sector, but across corrections, our government agency in charge of our prisons. If we apply it across the health sector, our hospitals, and we apply it in the private rental sector, of course, it pricks the conscience of the landlord, whoever that landlord might be, to need to pay some attention to where that tenant's going to go if they are evicted. And I have to add at the end of that, our average tenancy in New Zealand is still under 2 years. So we just had some extraordinary data. I mean, this must sound ridiculous from both of your perspectives, right? But this extraordinary data, and I can't think of it just right now, but Stats NZ, our government stats agency, released data about how many times school students were shifting house during their education careers. It's something like 50% of New Zealand school kids move 3 or 4 times during their schooling. So out of a school, into a school, out of a suburb, into a suburb.
Totally disruptive.
And, that's where the security of tenure principle of the right to housing kind of fits in, right?
So why are people moving so often?
Because we have no protections for tenants. So, we have very...
So you mean suddenly the landlord say, hey, tomorrow I will raise the rent 100%, or what? Or people have to move, or people just get kicked out, or what is the story?
Those kinds of things, yep. So there was an interesting conversation on Twitter recently that I followed, which was talking about a landlord who had been accused of discrimination in choosing a tenant. And the Twitter feed went on and thread went on and people talked about it. And basically the last this kind of aggregated knowledge of the Twitter community on that particular issue was the less a landlord says when they evict someone or when they make a choice about a tenant, the less they can be accused of discrimination. Right?
Okay, so they kick you out, but they don't talk.
That's it. Right. And so if you don't, it's like a lot of these legal areas, that if you haven't said something, you can't really be accused of it, right? And the seventh is availability of services, which is the infrastructure issue, right? Which is the driver on government and local government to actually deliver the right infrastructure in the right places. But most importantly, to have enough money to deliver that, because most of our local governments are currently throwing their hands up in the air saying, we want more housing, but we just don't have enough money to deliver the infrastructure.
Leilani, so your student is doing well, I understand.
What do you mean, my student?
This is your preaching, I think
my student. I'm sorry. No, Brennan is really leading. He's leading. I follow Brennan, frankly. I follow Brennan. He's much more intellectual than me. I wouldn't have even been able to get the 7 elements. I always forget. I forget them, especially that last one.
So, but I guess that Brennan also could consider you like the master of the human rights of housing. Isn't that like that, Brennan? Please say something nice.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you a little precursor question for Leilani, and then I'm going to explain how I see Leilani. So, Leilani, maybe you can take a moment to do one of 3 things, right? Because this is my little Bible at the moment, which is the human rights framework brings constructive accountability, participatory policy making, and access to justice. And that's what I love about it, because it's not just the 7 elements, right? It's this deeper... And those things are so relevant in New Zealand. We live in this era of policy by media release. At the moment, the first thing we know about a new policy is that we get a media release and find out about it, right?
Definitely.
So look, my story in relation to Leilani is, I was working for an organisation called the Independent Māori Statutory Board 4 years ago, and I got handed the housing portfolio, and we were sort of challenged or invited to develop a targeted for Māori housing strategy in Auckland. And so we did some research, and we very quickly came upon a report which at the time was quite new, written by Leilani during her tenure as the UN Special Rapporteur, which set out the idea of national rights-based housing strategies, and just really succinctly said, you can have as many policies as you like, but your policies are just going to tinker around the edge. If you want a great housing system, you need strategy. And if you're looking for some way to frame it or to measure it or to give it some bones, look at the right to housing. So absolutely eye-opening report, Frederick, frankly. And so a couple of years later when, as I said, Scott Figgenshow sort of had this idea of having the shift Aotearoa, and it's a no-brainer for me to try and get a hold of that job. So very happy that happened.
There you go.
The right to housing is, and I think Leilani has changed a lot, because a lot of activists around the world is actually using that language now. But I still think it's what you're bringing on here is more depth in this and the deeper understanding of those rights, because the other side will always say, hey, come on, it's not a human right to live in the middle of Auckland, it's like you always get these kind of, it's not a human right to live in a big city. It's not a human right to, should we give you an apartment now? It's like it becomes quite stupid. But I mean, when you talk to governments and your government, like my government, like Leilani's government has actually signed on to the Human Rights Declaration, the international law of human rights, where we have the right to housing. But obviously a lot of governments don't really know what they've signed on to. So that's the job you have to do, and you're doing, both of you, all the time.
It was just, so I've gone beyond the 7 elements, right? And I'm trying to increase knowledge of those 7 elements, absolutely. And a really interesting conversation at this provider last week where, you get into a community, they start not just asking you questions, but telling you stories about things that have happened in their families in relation to housing. And I remain in this position where I haven't really come across a housing story or a housing anguish or problem that I can't quite usefully frame through the right to housing. And so, we had one gentleman who was talking about his daughter having been kicked out of social housing because of some urban development, I think, some urban redevelopment. And so we talked about, well, if we had this human right implemented and she had genuine security of tenure, what would that have looked like? Would it have looked different, And so then someone else tells us a story about this awful house that they've lived in, and what terrible quality the house was. And I say, okay, so if we had this right to housing and we had the right to a habitable house, what would have looked different? Maybe, because of course this is the irony, right? This is what we're dancing around on the heads of pins about, is implementing the right to housing rhetorically doesn't change the quality of the housing in our housing system, right? But if we had the right to housing, and this is sort of framing up the question that I was hinting at before, is, one of the things. So I talk about these 3 other principles of the right to housing: constructive accountability, participatory policy making, and the third one, which I think relates to my conversation at the provider last week, is access to justice. So there's no implementing the right to housing and creating an idea that people have the right to habitable housing unless we can create access to justice. So that if that right is breached, and I feel like I'm kind of repeating some of Paul Hunt's recent speeches here, if that right is breached, a person has an ability to go to a forum or a tribunal or a formal body and say, I've got a complaint and I want you to hear it. So not, I don't have a house, you need to give me one, but I've got a complaint, my house is not habitable, here's some photos of it, I need you to consider that.
It sounds like a very decent idea. It doesn't sound like communism with red flags or, marching troops with Mao hats on, or I don't know. It's like, it sounds like decent, but I wish you were here in our country, in the debate we have here. I mean, we need people who can speak this language. Leilani, you've been quoted a lot in the newspapers this week in Sweden.
Is that right?
Yeah. So, I mean,
Good.
It's kind of interesting. There is a big crisis around market rents, and they talk to Leilani. It's cool.
Well, I just to say that it's funny about those 7 elements of the right to housing. I refer to those far less than I do those big principles that Brennan was talking about. I really love accountability because I like to be able to hold someone accountable to the crap that people are having to live with. And so the human rights framework, as both you, Brennan, and Frederick said, is about being able to say to governments, you're not doing good enough and you've signed all this international law. It's got to mean something. Breathe life into that, please, at the local level. So that's, to me, the best part of the human rights framework. And of course, having a remedy for a violation. So where you're not enjoying the right to housing, you should be able to have a remedy for that. And that goes to access to justice. So those are the big principles I tend to play around with. I don't know if it resonates. People in Sweden are talking about something. I don't know what I can't read Swedish yet, so I don't know what they're saying.
You have to step up. How many years have we been working together now? It's crazy.
Terrible.
Yeah, I know you need to shoot out in life and bring kids to school or other important stuff in your life, so we shouldn't keep you anymore. But I know you showed Push also for at your conference and so on. How did people react on the film?
That's a really great question, which really goes to the heart of all of this. So I've got to preface this, right? I just think the film's amazing and it's groundbreaking. And that's not just because I, like you guys, I mean, I do like you guys, but, the film itself just surfaces, it surfaces all of the right things, and it absolutely provides a gateway for New Zealanders into the conversation about the right to housing. And that's why I was so completely impressed by Radar's question during our recording, just that insight to think, is New Zealand a part of these big macro global things, or are we doing something genuinely different which is causing this? It's great. That's the question we should be asking, right? But Frederick, the reception to the film Push was poor in New Zealand. To the 2 screenings that I went to, it may have been screened otherwise. And I talked to some of the organisers of one of those screenings, and they had basically completely undersold the film. They had sold the film as a maybe something boring, like, this is relevant to housing providers and it's about the right to housing. Come and see it if you want to be bored by the right to housing.
And we all know housing is boring.
Well,
boring,
that's right,
boring.
Lele.
It is boring. But the film is not.
The film is not, and I guess it's part of that problem that maybe documentaries face, which is you want to address something serious, and you want to do it in a really in-depth way. I guess the audience gets maybe smaller and smaller in some way. People don't.
No, it's not true. It's not true. Actually, I mean, I don't know about the screenings in New Zealand. It's been shown around with the New Zealand film festivals in several cities, and maybe also other screenings. No, but general documentaries are doing really fine. Our genre is stronger than ever in more and more countries, and I think that's. But of course, it's never easy to bring people out. But I think it happens in a lot of places that this film has a good crowd. Anyway, we shouldn't talk about that, because you have to go to school and I have to go home and you have to. It's soon wine time for Leilani because it's getting into the evening. Maybe you could have some New Zealand wine.
It's the only wine I drink is New Zealand wine. Everyone knows that. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Which means then we can ask Brennan, do you have any idea how we fund Pushback Talks?
I believe people should visit Patreon and look you guys up and make a reasonable monthly donation, which is really easy to do via your credit card.
Amazing.
Right. Go to patreon.com, patreon.com, and look for Pushback Talks. And like, if you put $5, there could probably be a glass of wine for Leilani. And maybe also one for me. Anyway, but lovely to have you on. Leilani, are you happy? Or you feel dizzy with your second shot in your body?
No, I'm feeling great. Actually, we talked it out. We talked out my symptoms of the second shot, which is great. Thank you, Brennan, for joining us. It was great.
Oh, yeah. My pleasure, guys.
The only thing I have to say, and we'll have to have you back at some point so we can really get into what's happening with the Maori and housing, because it's such a huge issue, but maybe it deserves its own episode.
We should come back for that. It's been very nice to have you on. It's been complicated to set up this call because of the time zones. So I'm really happy that we made it. Thank you so much, Brennan, for being on. And my dear Leilani, we will meet again over a computer screen. Again and again.
Again and again. So true.
And again.
Thanks, Brendan.
Okay.
Thanks, Frederick.
Thank you, Leilani.
Bye.
See you soon. Bye. Bye.
Pushback Talks is produced by WG Film. To watch Push, visit pushthefilm.com. You can also support us by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/pushbacktalks. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next week.